Most people meet Vieques through images, bright water, white sand, and quiet beaches that look untouched. But the island's real story starts where that image stops. Vieques is a small Puerto Rican island municipality east of the main island, and despite its size, it became one of the most politically symbolic places in the Caribbean. For decades, global attention focused not on tourism, but on military exercises, local resistance, and the long argument over who gets to decide what an island is for. That is why Vieques matters. It is not just a destination. It is a case study in power, territory, and memory. The same coastline that now attracts travelers once existed inside restricted military zones. The same land that appears in vacation guides also appears in debates about contamination, legal rights, and environmental repair. If we only tell the postcard version, we erase the people of Vieques, the Viequenses, whose daily lives were shaped by decisions made far beyond their shores. This video follows the full arc: identity, military history, protest, withdrawal, and the unfinished reality that remains. Understanding Vieques begins with scale and location. The island is roughly 20 miles long and only a few miles wide, positioned about 8 miles east of Puerto Rico. That compact geography is important because it magnifies every policy choice. On a large landmass, military ranges can be distant from neighborhoods. On Vieques, distance is limited. Restricted zones, noise, and operational activity could not be mentally separated from ordinary life in the same way. Geography also shaped why federal military planners valued the island. Vieques sat in a strategic Caribbean position useful for training and testing, especially during periods when U.S. defense operations emphasized regional readiness. But strategic value for a military institution and livability for a local population are not the same thing. Over time, this mismatch became central. Land that residents might have used for local development, fishing access, or community continuity was increasingly folded into military logic. In practical terms, a small island became administratively fragmented between what locals needed and what external authorities prioritized. That tension, repeated over years, set the stage for conflict that eventually reached courts, media outlets, and international human rights conversations. Vieques also carries layered identity through language and naming. The name itself is tied to Taíno roots, often interpreted as meaning something like small island or small land, then rendered through Spanish spelling. It is also affectionately called Isla Nena, often translated as Little Girl Island or Puerto Rico's little sister. These names are not trivial details. They reflect how communities build emotional belonging in place. Naming can be cultural memory, not just geography. That matters because military narratives tend to flatten places into functional terms: range, sector, perimeter, asset. Local names do the opposite. They insist the island is lived, loved, and socially meaningful. So from the beginning, there were competing descriptions of Vieques, one human and relational, one strategic and operational. When those descriptions collide, policy conflict follows. Residents are not simply opposing a facility. They are defending a sense of home that includes culture, history, and future generations. In that context, protests were not only anti-military actions. They were claims about identity and political dignity. The island's story is therefore both environmental and cultural: who belongs, who decides, and whose reality counts when power is asymmetrical. The period of US Navy use turned those tensions into daily structure. Large portions of Vieques were used for bombing range activity and military testing. For outside observers, that can sound technical, but for residents it translated into concrete limits: restricted access to land, constant awareness of risk, disrupted routines, and reduced control over local planning. When coastlines become fenced or controlled, a community does not just lose scenery. It loses options for livelihoods, recreation, and intergenerational continuity. The island's famous beaches, now promoted under names like Caracas or La Chiva, existed within this historical landscape of control. That reversal is one reason Vieques remains emotionally and politically charged. It is difficult to celebrate reopened beauty without acknowledging why those areas were inaccessible for so long. Importantly, the issue was not only military presence in abstract. It was the scale of influence relative to a small civilian island. People felt their home had been operationalized. As years passed, grievances evolved from local frustration into broader demands around health, environmental safety, and democratic accountability, setting up the protest era that would eventually redefine the island's global image. Legal pathways became one battleground, but not an easy one. Cases and disputes challenged whether military practices should be constrained by environmental law, including federal water pollution frameworks. The legal landscape was complicated by jurisdictional structure and by the deference courts often grant to defense-related activity. A key moment came when the U.S. Supreme Court, in 1990, declined to consider a major question tied to whether courts were obligated to halt bombing under that legal framework. For many residents and advocates, that felt like institutional distance from lived reality. But legal disappointment did not end the movement. Instead, it clarified a hard truth: courtroom strategy alone would likely be insufficient. That realization pushed organizing outward into public protest, moral framing, and coalition pressure. In social movements, this pattern is common. Legal channels define boundaries, but political mobilization changes consequences. Vieques became a powerful example of this interaction. As legal routes narrowed, civic resistance broadened. Religious groups, students, artists, community leaders, and public figures amplified the issue until it could no longer be treated as a marginal local complaint. The law shaped the battlefield, but public solidarity reshaped the balance of power. The protest movement gained force because it connected specific local harm to universal principles. Activists framed Vieques not just as a military policy dispute, but as a question of human dignity, environmental justice, and self-determination. That framing mattered because it invited wider participation across Puerto Rico and beyond. Civil disobedience actions, public demonstrations, and persistent media engagement kept attention focused over time rather than fading after short news cycles. Just as important, the movement maintained moral clarity. A populated island should not be treated as expendable training ground without meaningful consent and protection. This argument resonated across political differences. People who disagreed on other issues could still understand the ethical contradiction. Over time, maintaining operations in Vieques became politically costly for institutions that depended on public legitimacy. That did not happen overnight. It required sustained pressure, organizational discipline, and narrative coherence. But eventually the pressure worked. In 2003, the Navy ended operations and withdrew. For many observers, this was a landmark victory for grassroots organizing in the Caribbean, proving that small communities can challenge entrenched systems when they build broad, persistent alliances around clear moral claims. Withdrawal in 2003 marked a turning point, but not a full resolution. A common mistake is to treat departure as closure, as if conflict disappears once operations stop. Vieques shows why post-military landscapes are more complicated. Former naval lands were transferred into a national wildlife refuge framework, which opened opportunities for conservation and public access. Yet substantial areas remained closed due to contamination concerns and unexploded ordnance. This created a dual reality, symbolic victory and practical constraint. Residents gained major political validation, but still lived with inherited hazards and uncertainty about timelines for full recovery. In policy terms, this is a transition from active conflict to legacy management. The headlines change, but obligations remain. Cleanup is expensive, technical, and slow, especially where ecological protection and human safety must be balanced. For communities, delay can feel like a second form of burden. The original source of harm is gone, but daily life is still shaped by its aftereffects. Vieques therefore complicates easy narratives of triumph. It was a real victory, but one that required a long second chapter focused on remediation, transparency, and equitable redevelopment. The environmental dimension deserves careful attention because it is both scientific and political. Unexploded ordnance cannot be approached casually. It demands specialized detection, controlled disposal, and strict exclusion protocols. Chemical contamination adds long-term monitoring needs and risk communication challenges. Even when cleanup progresses, trust depends on whether communities receive clear data, credible oversight, and honest timelines. Technical success without social legitimacy is fragile. Vieques illustrates this clearly. Residents who lived through decades of external control are unlikely to accept vague assurances. They want transparent benchmarks and meaningful participation in decisions about land access and safety. That is not obstruction. It is democratic accountability after prolonged dispossession. Environmental remediation in inhabited territories must therefore include public governance design, who communicates findings, how independent review works, and how local priorities influence sequencing of reopened areas. In other words, cleanup is not only about removing hazards from soil and shoreline. It is also about repairing relationships between institutions and communities. Without that relational repair, recovery remains partial even if technical milestones are met on paper. At the same time, Vieques is undeniably beautiful, and that beauty has become central to its economic future. Beaches on the island's eastern and western ends are frequently ranked among the Caribbean's finest, with azure water and white sands that attract global tourism interest. Tourism can provide real opportunities, jobs, small business growth, transport services, and revenue for local initiatives. But tourism-led recovery also carries risks if unmanaged. Rising demand can increase living costs, strain infrastructure, and shift ownership patterns away from local residents. So the critical question is not whether visitors should come. It is whether development is structured around community benefit and ecological limits. If recovery reproduces extraction under a different label, the island's political victory loses substance. If instead policy supports local ownership, protects cultural continuity, and aligns access with environmental safety, tourism can reinforce resilience. Vieques stands at that crossroads. It can be marketed as paradise, but it cannot be planned as blank slate. Its past places obligations on the present, remember what happened, and design growth that does not silence the people whose persistence made this chapter possible. There is also a memory dimension that outsiders often miss. For many Viequenses, places now associated with leisure are also places layered with protest history, exclusion, and eventual return. That creates emotional complexity, pride in resistance, grief over losses, and caution about narratives that simplify the past. Collective memory influences politics because it shapes what communities consider acceptable going forward. Younger generations inherit not just scenic landscapes but stories of mobilization and sacrifice. Those stories can become civic resources, helping communities insist on better governance and stronger safeguards. But memory can also be diluted if public storytelling shifts entirely to tourism branding. That is why historical literacy matters. Accurate narration is not symbolic decoration, it is protection against repeating harmful patterns. In practice, preserving memory can involve education, local cultural work, and public framing that acknowledges both harm and recovery. Vieques offers a model of resilience precisely because it does not fit a single category. It is not only a victim story and not only a success story. It is an ongoing process where identity, justice, and development must be negotiated together. Beyond the island itself, Vieques raises broader questions about territorial governance and accountability. How should democratic systems handle places where strategic decisions are made far from the communities most affected? What standards should apply when national security goals conflict with local health, environment, and autonomy? Vieques suggests that formal legality is not enough if consent and protection are weak. It also shows that marginalized communities can alter outcomes through sustained, coalition-based pressure. This lesson applies globally, not just in Puerto Rico. Many regions host high-impact facilities because they are politically easier to burden than wealthier or more central districts. Vieques challenges that pattern by demonstrating the power of persistent civic action tied to clear ethical claims. For policymakers, the takeaway is practical: include affected communities early, publish transparent risk data, and build enforceable remediation commitments before harm accumulates. For audiences, the takeaway is interpretive. When you see a beautiful destination, ask what histories made that landscape visible in its current form. In Vieques, the answer includes struggle, strategy, and unfinished responsibility. So what does Vieques ultimately represent? It represents the refusal of a small community to accept that strategic convenience should override human dignity. It represents the idea that environmental justice includes cleanup, transparency, and local voice long after headlines move on. And it represents a warning: recovery narratives become hollow if they erase the conditions that made recovery necessary. Vieques today is both invitation and instruction. It invites people to witness extraordinary natural beauty, but it instructs us to see that beauty with context. The island's future depends on balancing conservation, access, economic opportunity, and historical truth. That balance is difficult, but not impossible. The same persistence that forced political change can guide long-term stewardship if institutions remain accountable and communities remain centered in decisions. In the end, Vieques is not just a story about what happened to one island. It is a blueprint for how places marked by imposed power can reclaim direction, one policy fight, one cleanup milestone, and one act of collective memory at a time. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.